Hey there, this is Michelle Smith, co-founder and principal of Circle Forward, and I welcome you to the Consent Bootcamp. If you're exploring consent-based governance for your systems change initiative, here are 10 things to know about why the principle of consent is key for operationalizing equity, transparency, and forward momentum. Number 10, consent is a principle, it's not a process. Consent as a principle for governance like transparency or accountability, there are a lot of processes for practicing the principle of consent. Several of these processes we will be introducing and sharing with you in the Consent Bootcamp, and you've probably experienced many of them already. When you're with your group in the real life sessions, you'll be getting coaching on the 3-step Circle Forward decision-making process, which works really well for just regular meetings. The advice process works great to give you more autonomy without waiting for meetings so that people and teams can move forward together without sort of having to wait for meetings. And then liberating structures is a whole menu of processes that are wonderful for co-design and engagement and freeing up creativity in large groups. So as I say, all of these are included in a package of resources that we'll send you after this session. And all of them are designed to be inclusive, to shift power dynamics, and all of them are designed and based on that principle of consent. Number 9, we're already familiar with the value of consent for addressing power dynamics. Sexual relationships, obviously, also informed consent, as in medical situations. For example, doctors can't perform surgery or other medical procedures without your consent. And then the consent of the governed is embedded into our own Constitution. And that's where power is invested in the people, and the people can withdraw their consent and create a new system of government or replace leaders. And here at Circle Forward, we'd certainly love to bring this idea of consent back into our politics today. Number 8, consent arises within a range of tolerance. The range of tolerance model comes out of ecosystem theory. It's a basic worldview that we're deeply interconnected. This sense of operating like an ecosystem is a really valuable metaphor for collaborative networks and for systems change. In any decision, some people are going to prefer it and they're going to think it's a great idea. It was probably their idea. And some people are going to just be fine either way. They can live with it, doesn't really matter to them, doesn't necessarily affect them all that much. And then for some people, there may be some part of the decision that they simply cannot tolerate. So we say they are out of consent. An objection is what you say when you're out of your range of tolerance. Instead of objection, sometimes people will feel or express just concern or resistance or discomfort, or just sometimes they're just feeling some kind of way. Often that feeling comes up before we can put into language what exactly it is that we're concerned about or that we have an objection to. But we're in consent when no one has a significant objection, or when no one can identify a risk that we can't afford to take. Another way we often hear people express this is it's good enough to try and safe enough to fail. People really like that one. In complex systems, every action is an experiment. So since we recognize that, we're going to put in measures and triggers to get feedback and about our actions so that we can learn and that we can adapt together. Marginalized communities have been being forced to live outside their range of tolerance forever. Objections are either ignored or labeled as dangerous. And in fact, being forced to live outside their range of tolerance might, to a certain degree, be a characteristic of marginalization. When diverse members of an ecosystem are able to live within their range of tolerance, the whole ecosystem becomes more resilient and adaptive. If you watched our short video, Ecosystems of Consent, you remember the little piece about the trout in the mountain stream. You know that the trout has a range of tolerance for the temperature of water, for example. And so do all the other members of the system, the trees, the plants, the little bugs that the trout eat, the little crustaceans. And they're all part of the system, and they're all adjusting within that range of tolerance. And when all of those members and that diversity of membership can live within its range of tolerance, then you get not only something that's where the trout can live, but something that's beautiful and that's flourishing and that's life-giving and life-generating. Adapting to address all of the objections around an issue or a proposal generates decision-making and action that allows us to move forward as an interdependent whole.
A core team in a food systems network was making decisions about how they were going to award mini grants to on-the-ground projects that addressed community food security. The urgency to get the funds out into the field put pressure on the team to make a decision. They were a diverse group of people, some academics, some institutional partners, and some people from community-based organizations who might actually want to apply for the mini grants. They valued having these different perspectives at the table as they discussed funding priorities and how to make the application process more accessible. But there were conflicting opinions when it came to designing the application. Was it ethical for members from community agencies to participate in the design of the actual application when they might apply for the grant funds? A professor said no, and a community agency rep said yes. They couldn't resolve the issue in the meeting and made plans to meet separately to unpack their concerns. When they did, instead of debating, they inquired into what was out of the range of tolerance for each of them. They asked the question, what is the risk we cannot afford to take? And listened to each other's objections about what they thought were unacceptable risks. Here's what they discovered. The professor was actually concerned that there might be a perception about conflict of interest, not an actual conflict of interest. If the community partners applying for awards were involved in the design of the application, that perception was a risk the project could not afford to take, because it would undermine the project's credibility and trust in the community. The community agency director was concerned about the integrity of inviting community-based representatives into the decision-making process and then just withholding that power when issues got sticky. That was a power dynamic that was all too familiar, and it was not in her range of tolerance. That power dynamic was a risk the project could not afford to take because it would undermine the trust within this core team. The conversation had gotten hot because they were holding these two deep values, one for the trust of the wider community and one for the trust within this team. Once they discerned the reasons for concern and chose to respect what was important to each of them, they found a way forward. The decision was to include the community partners in decisions about the application design as well as full decision makers, and to be fully transparent in all public communications about their participation. Of course, they were simultaneously clear that none of those community-based organizations who were applying for a grant would be involved in selecting grant recipients, which would be a clear conflict of interest. So they didn't waste time and risk their relationships with debates. Using the range of tolerance model, the group was able to consent on a path forward together.
Number 7, consent is felt in the body. It's felt in our nervous system. Our nervous system will register for us when we're in consent or out of consent. And really, consent mostly just feels chill. It just feels like a sense of relaxed safety. There can be a sense of joy and positive energy and laughter and greater connection. And sometimes it's just ease and willingness and satisfaction to let things move forward. But there's that sense of general safety. Finding that sweet spot of consent can be really undramatic. Sometimes it's really marked by what didn't happen, the arguments and drama that didn't happen. But sometimes it can be kind of magical and healing because it releases the creativity of the group. Objection is also felt in the body. Again, the nervous system registers that. Being out of your range of tolerance comes with a stress response. In fact, that's your evidence, often even before language can be found to describe the risk you're sensing. Don't kid yourself. People don't just suck it up. Not for long and not forever. People won't live outside their range of tolerance for long. In natural systems, when conditions continue to be out of the range of tolerance, we say members stop participating. We say we'll see them migrate, they'll stop reproducing, they'll mutate, or ultimately they'll die. But what does it look like in human systems when conditions are out of our range of tolerance? Well, in those human systems, it looks like frustration or withdrawal or just not participating. It can look like absence or sabotage or sandbagging or talking in the parking lot and complaining, outside the meetings. When my objections have been ignored, my pattern is to I say, let the train wreck. Have you ever had that, like, nobody's listening to me? Well, I don't know why I should bother to participate. And let me just let them go, and we'll see what happens in the end. So I wonder if you've ever let the train wreck with your withdrawal. Number 6, objections are treasure because they reveal our blind spots. We should treat these objections like gold. We all have blind spots. And I hope you got to watch the fun videos that go along with session 1 that illustrate our blind spots. We all have them, and much of the time we just don't know what we don't know. We're all sensing different things. So listening and adapting to objections increases the wisdom of our decisions and our actions. And really, your objections belong to the group. If you have a responsibility to share your objections. If you're not expressing that you're sensing a risk, the system could experience damage and even breakdown. Marginalized communities have learned behaviors that enable them to exist outside their range of tolerance. A natural system's correspondence might be that mutation. They've just learned behaviors that allow them to exist outside their range of tolerance. So for some people, it can be really hard to express objections. It could take a while for a group to get used to hearing each other's objections, and for a person to really feel safe offering their objections. There's a lot of pressure to conform or just go along. And especially if your objections have been historically ignored or considered dangerous, it can just take a minute for them to emerge and for them to sort of surface. So on the other side of the coin, the group has a responsibility to make space for people to share their objections. We need to slow down to speed up. We can only move at the speed of trust. And encountering objections actually builds trust when it's treasured for the wisdom it contains. It might take some time, it can be vulnerable, but it can be very courageous to express your objection, especially early on when a network's getting to know each other. But if it's treasured, if it's treated like gold for the wisdom it contains, whether you agree with the wisdom or not, then the decision or the proposal is adapted to meet the objection, then trust really starts to build. Trying to persuade people out of their objections so we can, just get things done and be really efficient, it just ignores that piece of wisdom that they're sensing. So imagine a car with a flat tire, and the 3 other tires, they have a 75% majority and they want to keep going. What's going to happen? As the saying goes, no doesn't mean convince me. The tire isn't going to be convinced that there's no risk to the system. And if the system just keeps going, there's going to be deeper and deeper damage done to the system. What happens in our human networks is that we don't get that buy-in and participation that our networks must have to meet the mission. I've done this myself. I've tried to persuade people out of their objections because of that sense of urgency. I'll hear myself saying, no, it'll be fine, and trying to tell someone who sees a risk why that isn't a risk, and then try to amplify that persuasion. But the more I practice, the more I remember that maybe I have a blind spot. And so very likely we have a blind spot because everyone does. And that's the practice. Listening and asking deeper questions when someone else might be out of their range of tolerance helps us overcome our own blind spots and see a bigger picture. And then our whole network becomes wiser. We don't have to agree with their sense of the risk in order to adapt. Tracy shares this particularly dramatic story about how the range of tolerance tool helped the boards of directors of a community center that also ran a school. It was right after a school shooting in another state, and the board was looking at their policies. And there was just a major difference of values around this concealed weapon policy, which I'm sure you can imagine, knowing that there's a major value difference in our whole country around these policies. Some members of the board felt that a clear policy of no concealed weapons was the safest course of action. Other members thought that the center could only be safe when they could protect themselves, and they opposed a concealed weapons policy. The difference of opinion reflected the differences in the community that this center served, and the perspectives of each side was putting the other side out of their range of tolerance. They were upset and they couldn't even talk to each other. And it seemed like it was a either or situation. And so they came to the meeting with just a lot of stress and even despair. But using the range of tolerance framework, Tracy asked them this question: what is the risk we cannot afford to take? And people talked about their different scenarios, and the group was able to get to that seed kernel of wisdom from each perspective. For example, they uncovered that the real concern with the concealed weapon policy by a few board members was their concern about alienating members of their community who carried concealed weapons, because they existed to serve the whole community, and that would risk their overall mission. On the other side of the spectrum, although it was clearly against the law to have concealed weapons in a school, they weren't clear about how that law applied to their community center. And they were concerned about putting the organization at risk by sliding into a legal gray area. The question became, how can we have both? How can we stay on solid legal ground and fulfill our board duties and be welcoming and safe place for the whole community? Once they framed the discussion this way around their key concerns, they were able to brainstorm several ways to resolve that tension. And the mood lightened. Because everybody's nervous system calmed down, the whole mood in the room lightened up. And in the end, they decided on a no concealed weapons policy with certain exceptions that were legally allowable. So we don't want to overwhelm objections with the pressures like we need to get this done. We can be impatient with the process, but years later, still cleaning up the mess. So was it really efficient when that pain just keeps coming up, or the breakdown or damage is done? Some other things we say when we're not wanting to make space for objections are things like, we can't please everybody, and people need to learn to compromise, and we don't have all day, and you weren't at the meeting. But when we talk about centering marginalized voices, we're talking about listening deeply for those objections and adapting and being humble and knowing that we have blind spots. And that's the practice. Number 5, consent is not compliance, and it is not compromise, and it is not unanimous agreement. Consent is not going along because not going along is too costly or more trouble than it's worth. And consent is not giving up something important to get something else important. So it's not compromise either. Consent is not unanimous agreement. Sometimes this is what people mean when they say consensus, and it's worth spending a moment here on the difference between consent and consensus. Because almost any time that I talk about consent or introduce consent to someone, people immediately equate it with consensus. And often they tell me how draining or frustrating or even inequitable their experience has been. Some truly painful experiences that surface the baggage from consent-oriented cultures that a lot of us carry. Some of that baggage is thinking everyone needs to be a part of and to approve every decision. And then later micromanaging people who are taking on responsibility until they burn out with frustration and resentment. Some of that baggage is treating everyone's opinion as equally valid in all situations, and perpetuating the illusion that we have equal power, like not recognizing and acknowledging power dynamics explicitly. And then we create shadow power dynamics where things are being decided outside of that space. Instead, consent has been called a breakthrough version of consensus because it meets the value that consensus is trying to meet, which is that inclusivity and wiser decision making. But consent-based cultures recognize that we're never going to have equal power or equal contributions to make in every situation. But our practices can enable each of us to get what we need to survive and succeed based on where we are and where we want to go. So we may not be able to have that, we may not be equal all the time, but we can have that value of equity. We can leave all this baggage behind and create the conditions for equity, transparency, and forward momentum.
And not all consent processes happen in meetings. An example of this was in a regional network of community members and partners who were working together to stimulate the local economy. The initiative had attracted many key community partners through organizing events, but a few folks saw the need for a more concrete action. A couple of folks formed a small team around the idea of a marketing campaign for local businesses and attractions. They shopped the idea around with a variety of other people in what we would call an advice process, making sure that people who would be impacted and benefited by the campaign, as well as people who had expertise, were consulted. They shaped and reshaped the concept, adjusted what was unacceptable until they seemed to have what they started to hear was a good plan worth launching. Then they used what they had heard, put together a rough website, messaging, and materials. When the quarterly meeting of the whole came around, they asked to be on the agenda to present what they had developed thus far. Without any fuss, there was a consent for what they were doing because the team really had been seeking consent all along in dozens of small ways. At one point in the meeting, though, there emerged a teachable moment about the difference between consent and consensus. One of the participants in the meeting was relatively new. He listened to what they were doing, and when it was his turn in the round to express consent or not, he started to question the strategy they were taking. It didn't seem to him like the campaign was what was needed, and he started suggesting a different approach. This person, though new, held a lot of personal power, so the small team was put on the defensive to justify their work. Luckily, one of our facilitators was there to remind the participants that they were not approving the campaign. They were testing it for consent. Was there a risk with the campaign? Was it safe enough to fail while still being good enough to try? Sure, it wasn't out of anyone's range of tolerance. That meant the team could keep moving using the input that day as they saw fit. Without the facilitator's intervention, the group might have seen their role as to approve the campaign and that they were not in consensus. They might have had a long discussion, giving as much weight to the new ideas as the ones that had been vetted for months. The small team that took initiative might have left the meeting frustrated and deflated. Instead, they felt empowered, and that campaign has grown to be one of the primary strategies of the initiative.
Number 4, consent creates the conditions for self-organizing. So in human systems and our networks, there are 2 conditions for self-organizing: a clear and shared purpose and equity. Clear and shared purpose is that clear sense of where we're going together, and then equity is that freedom to organize in the ways that meet that purpose. And we can see a metaphor for that in this natural system of the murmuration of starlings, a big flock of starlings that are getting up and going to go fly. You know, the flock is going to fly. And so they have a clear and shared purpose for the whole flock to get up and airborne and go where they want to go. But each member of the system has the freedom to adjust and within the air and within each other so that they're not bumping into each other, but they can all get up and they all want to get up and express themselves as starlings and fly together. So similarly in our human organizations, there's a correspondence. The thing about, we've talked about equity and processes that keep us within the range of tolerance, and that clear and shared purpose is that shared sense of what would be at risk or that there is a risk. This shared purpose for your networks would be codified in your values, vision, mission, aims, principles, guiding frameworks. There's lots of vocabulary around this, but they're all touchstones of purpose, and it is important that they all be codified. Number 2, consent also works for people who have positional power. Using the range of tolerance framework, people who hold accountability for the whole initiative don't need to give up power. They just need to give up control for the system to self-organize. We would never ask someone with positional power to give up their power. We want to assure those people that their consent, they're not expected to go outside their range of tolerance, and the accountabilities that they have any more than anyone else is. And number one is that culture doesn't transform from reading top 10 lists. We need to experience consent in action and know that that's what we're doing and see how we got there. We have to learn and practice these skill sets and practices for a culture of consent. Knowing these concepts is not enough. Tendency is to revert to habits we learn in the dominant culture, like debate and overpowering. And this even happens within our team at Circle Forward. We're constantly in a state of practice ourselves and bringing ourselves back to these practices. So it's really good to have a coach who can help you navigate these processes so that the group can get to consent again and again and experience how to get there. And then pretty soon consent becomes a part of the culture. And that's when the group starts to actually operationalize the equity, transparency, and forward momentum. So thank you. I hope these top 10 things to know about consent and governance have been a help for you. And you're welcome to share it with all your people in your network. Thanks so much.